Hi Booktube, it's Amy. I'm here with a very macabre bookish subject today. And this is a subject that came up in a book that I read earlier this week. The Madman's Library by Edward Brooke Hitchings, which has a section in it on Anthropodermic Bibliopegy, which is a fancy way of saying books bound with human skin. Which is very creepy, and it's something I had come across now and then in a couple of books I'd read before, but I had not to date found any book that dealt specifically with the frequency and the why and sort of the ethical and social questions behind books bound in human skin. But this book, Madman's Library, had a reference to another book published in 2020. Both these books are from 2020, and this one was great, by the way. But it led me to a book by Megan Rosenblum titled Dark Archives, A Librarian's Investigation into the Science and History of Books Bound in Human Skin. And in this book, she explains exactly what a book bound in human skin is, the periods when this practice was most common, and some of the myths about how these books were created and why they were created, and also the scientific process, which is fairly new, that actually allowed her team to begin to identify whether books rumored to be bound in human skin were indeed human skin. And she broke down exactly what this term anthropodermic bibliopegy means. So anthropos, obviously human, derma, skin, biblion, book, and pega, fasten. So this term literally means to fasten a book with human skin. But for the sake of her text, she often refers to them as just anthropodermic books, or as books bound with skin, human skin. And for the sake of this video, I'm just going to begin to refer to them as books bound with human skin, which is a creepy topic, but also a somewhat intriguing one. Immediately, as soon as you hear, someone bound a book with human skin, you think, are they a serial killer? What could possibly lead someone to do such a thing? And it's a bit shocking when you find out that it was a somewhat common practice. Perhaps I shouldn't say common practice, but many of the existing examples that have been positively identified as indeed being bound in real human skin were books belonging to doctors, specifically doctors in the 19th century in the United States and in the United Kingdom. Or at the very least, that's where Megan Rosenblum's team was able to test and able to positively identify these books. And so there are several doctors that she cites in this work who took skin from their patients after death, took a piece of thigh skin, for example, tossed it into a chamber pot or something to preserve it, and took it to a tanner and had it made into a piece of leather, and then had a book bound, which is shocking to think about from our perspective. But there was a time when this was not particularly uncommon. It wasn't legal. It was something that doctors would have no qualms about doing. Now, don't misunderstand me here. The author is not saying that this was common practice. She's just saying that this is something that a small number of doctors would do. And obviously, from a contemporary and modern perspective, we would see a doctor taking any part of a patient's body and using it for his own personal use as desecration of a body. And Megan Rosenblum definitely comes at it at first from that perspective, and questions, how could doctors just desecrate a body in this way? How could they see their patient as so dehumanized that they could just take a piece of their skin, as you would a piece of skin from an animal, and make it into a book? And the book here is really interesting, Dark Archives, because she takes a bit of a dive into medical practices at the time surrounding autopsies and cadavers, and specifically how students and doctors were taught to be doctors, and where the human remains that they used to learn and practice on were sourced from. And so there was definitely a culture and a perspective at that time that led in the 19th century to this practice of just taking parts of the patient or taking parts of a cadaver for medical purposes as medical waste, as something that you could use for your own purposes without legal ramifications and without apparently moral ramifications. And I think one of the creepiest passages in this book is in a chapter titled Gentlemen Collectors, which talks specifically about these 19th century doctors. And in 1868, we have Dr. John Stockton Hough, who was a known doctor who had books bound in human skin. He is a doctor who took skin from his patients, had it taken to a tanner, and had books specifically made. But it goes beyond just the using of the material. In each of his books, he actually made a notation within the book where the material was sourced from. So Rosenblum says here, it was during the autopsy that Hough removed the skin from Lynch's thigh from a woman by the name of Mary Lynch, who had died and who was eventually buried in a pauper's grave. She came into the hospital quite ill, died there, and Dr. John Stockton Hough performed an autopsy and took it upon himself to take a piece of her body for his own personal use. And it says that Hough preserved her skin in a chamber pot. And so that was a common prepping method for tanning skin at the time. We would put it into urine or lye to preserve it before it could be properly tanned. But it's just this very disgusting image of a doctor disrespecting his patient so much that he would take a piece of her skin and toss it into his own chamber pot, into probably his own urine, to preserve it, and then just dumping her body in a pauper's grave and getting a book bound. And he had several examples of books bound in human skin in his library that eventually made their way to institutions, and that's where many of the books bound in human skin have made their way over the years. And it's interesting as well because Rosenblum also debunks a lot of the stories and myths that have emerged over the years regarding books with human skin. When you think of a book bound in human skin, you might immediately think of Nazi Germany or the French Revolution. There's an entire chapter here on the French Revolution and how there were rumors and propaganda about the remains of people killed during the Reign of Terror in the French Revolution being taken and made into leather products to bind books and to make breeches and wallets. But Rosenblum says that in all the research that has been done, there's no evidence that this actually occurred, and the one possible work that she knows of that is purported to be bound in human skin, might actually be human skin, is a copy of the French Constitution from that time period. But at this point in time, when this book was published in 2020, it had not yet been tested. And you would think it would be relatively easy to test a book, to test a object, to figure out whether it is indeed human skin. But apparently it's not so easy. Until about 5 years ago, the only way to test whether a book was indeed human skin was visually. So you would look at the grain of the leather, look at the pattern of the pores, and you could sort of guess whether it was bound in human skin, and that's what a lot of the books in libraries and collections throughout the world, that's how a lot of them had been, quote, authenticated. But Rosenblum in this text talks about a new method using, and I wrote out here in notes, peptide mass fingerprinting, otherwise known as PMF testing. And so this is using a mass spectrometer to look at the amino acids of proteins to figure out which family the material comes from. And at this point, they can only narrow it down to the family that the material comes from. And so at this point, the mass spectrometer can be used to narrow the material of a book down to the ape family. Now, as Rosenblum points out, there are no known cases of ape skin being used to make a book. And so if you test a book and it comes up as the material being from the ape family, it is almost certain that that book is indeed bound in human skin. She explains why DNA testing isn't really an option at this point because of the tanning process that materials go through before they're bound into books. That pretty much destroys any DNA that could possibly be tested, and in addition to that, any leftover DNA material would be compromised by the constant handling and touching of these books by other human beings. So at this point, PMF testing is really the only way to do it. And there's a website as well, but she basically has a team, and it's a project they're doing to go about and test as many of these rumored human skin bound books as possible to figure out whether they are authentic or whether they are hoaxes. And there are a lot more hoaxes than you would suppose. Specifically, and she deals a lot with the moral and social issues that come into play when you start talking about books bound in human skin. But she points out that in almost every case where a book has been claimed to be bound in human skin, and it mentions the color of the person's skin, and almost all those cases it turns out to be a hoax, probably a hoax created for money, for monetary value. For instance, she talks about a small notebook that was purported to be made of human skin, specifically of the skin of someone who was killed at the Boston Massacre, which, as I understand, is one of the events that led to the start of the American Revolutionary War. And it claimed to be made from the skin of the black man who had died in that incident. And Rosenblum tested this little notebook and confirmed that it indeed was a hoax. And she questioned why over and over again, when books claim to be bound in the skin of a racialized person, why those so often turned out to be hoaxes. And she pointed out that in none of her research had she come across a book specifically stating that the skin was that of a white person. And so she looks into that social factor of how perhaps, well, maybe skin isn't mentioned when it's a white person because it's predominantly, white male doctors in the 19th century who were binding these books. And so white was the default to them. But she also talks about how at this point it's difficult, if not impossible, to tell the background of the person whose skin was made into a book, because DNA testing really won't tell you much when it is eventually possible, and the PMF testing, as she says, only really narrows it down to the animal family, so to apes, which humans are closely related to. But as I mentioned, no real evidence that human bookbinding was at all common during the French Revolution, which is often what you think of, and also no evidence that she found that the Nazis were binding books in human skin. But she does make a conclusion at the end of this book that if any books were bound in human skin during those periods in time. And if, and you know, you hate to say it, but it's quite possible, if books have been bound in human skin in more recent years, it's quite likely that they are in private collections and that they're not something that researchers are going to have access to. And she notes in here that the most recent book they came across bound in human skin was from 1934. So people have been binding books in human skin in the last 100 years, which is quite unnerving to think about. And quite an unnerving and macabre book to read, but interesting all the same. And I will certainly be interested in years to come to see what more comes out of this research project that Rosenblum is working on, because I certainly don't think she's done. And you know, it's interesting to see what will emerge. She talks about some of the moral and ethical implications around testing these books and why certain institutions or private collectors are hesitant to have theirs tested. First of all, when it comes to public institutions, having a book tested brings it into the public eye and could potentially generate bad press. There's a lot of institutions that would rather just let these books lie in their archives, sort of unknown, and out of any controversy that could arise from bringing these into the public eye. Because in most cases, with the exception of one that she came across, where a prisoner wrote his memoirs before his death and then requested that his skin be taken and bound in several copies of his memoirs. With the exception of that case, almost every other case she's come across, there's no indication that the remains of these people were taken with their consent. So this is a case where people whose skin were made into book bindings had it done against their will, without their consent, which of course goes into the larger issue with a lot of early medicine, a lot of early medical practices where people were really not consenting to having their bodies dissected after death. And there's a whole chapter in here on the criminal system in the United Kingdom and how it was often murderers whose bodies were used for medical studies before the laws changed. But as soon as you start digging these books out of archives and confirming that they indeed are human skin, you come into the problem of consent and what to do with these books once you know that they are indeed the remains of a human being. There's sort of one camp that says these books should be potentially returned to the families or the cultures or the areas from which these people came. One of the problems with that is that most of these book bindings made from human skin are from unknown people. So we have no idea where they came from or how these people came to be part of a book. A second suggestion comes up is that these books should be either cremated or properly buried. But if you go that route, then that goes along with the thinking that anything remotely doing with human remains should be removed from all museums and all archives and should be buried. So that goes along the lines of, you know, no more skeletons, no more medical curiosities, no more preserved tattoos, no more Egyptian mummies. That is the school of thought that says everything should be properly buried respectfully or cremated respectfully, and that we shouldn't have anything made of human remains anywhere. And then there is an opposing perspective, which I believe is the perspective of Rosenblum in this book, that says, you know, regardless of what happened in the past, these books now exist, and we should continue to allow them to exist so that they can be studied and so that we can understand them in their proper context. And it's definitely this emerging school of thought around a lot of historical artifacts that says they exist, let's not destroy them, let's not erase history, let's rather leave them to be studied in their proper context. And I think I sort of fall into that school of thought here. There's not really much of a point in destroying these books bound with human skin because the damage has been done. I would rather they be left, respectfully in an archive somewhere to be understood in their proper context, and perhaps to ensure that people in the future understand that such things did happen, and to understand the context in which they happened, to perhaps prevent people's remains from being made into books without their consent in the future. But this does lead to the other side of things, where the question comes into my mind. If somebody, as was the case in one case in this book, if somebody wants to have their skin made into a book binding after death, should that be allowed? Should we allow that to happen? It's certainly a macabre thing to do, but is it really any different than having somebody's tattoos preserved after death? Because that's something that currently happens. Is it any different than having your body embalmed and stuck in the ground? Because it is a process. You're being chemically processed and being preserved in some way. We have, world leaders preserved and embalmed in glass coffins for all the world to see. We have mummies in museums that come from different cultures. And getting your skin made into a book is certainly very macabre, a little bit odd. But if someone so chose, if someone consented to have this done with their skin, is it something that we should allow? And so I don't know where to land on this question, but it certainly is something to think about. And I don't know if you've ever thought about this question. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And as I'm filming this video, probably not something I'm going to try to monetize, because I don't think YouTube is going to allow me to monetize a video where I am talking about books bound in human skin. But certainly is an interesting topic, and if your interest is at all piqued by the topic, I would definitely recommend picking up this book titled Dark Archives that was published last year. And I was also thinking about the idea, if I had a chance to pick up a book bound in human skin, would I do it, or would I be too creeped out to do it? Because according to Rosenblum, for the most part, you can't tell. Human skin made into a book binding looks very similar to pig skin, sometimes to rabbit skin, and occasionally even to horse hide. And so when it comes down to it, visually it's not that much different than other tanned skin made into leather and used to bind a book. So I'm not sure whether I would dare to pick up a book bound in human skin, or whether it would just be too creepy. But that's another question. Let me know in the comments below if you would dare to pick up a book bound in human skin. Certainly a complex issue, and not something that I think there's a clear answer to. It's very easy to say, we should never bind books in human skin at all. But the fact is, these books do exist, and we have to do something with them. So I think I'll leave it there. Greatly enjoyed reading this book. And as I said, do let me know what you thought of this topic in the comments below.